Joining us now in the studio is Luba Levitsky, Educational Programs Marketing Manager with Control Data Corporation. Luba, we've heard about the PLATO system from Control Data for a long time. What is PLATO? Give us a little background on it.
Basically, PLATO is a highly interactive, graphic-based, individualized, computer-based education system. And by individualized, I mean self-paced, and the instruction is tailored to the needs of each individual student.
Okay, you're online now with PLATO on a chemistry lab experiment of
That's
some
right.
sort, and show me what this does.
Basically, this is a simulation of a fractional distillation experiment, and it simulates operations and processes of an actual experiment. Prior to this screen, the student has already touched the screen and assembled the distillation apparatus as they would in a regular experiment. The objective is to heat the still and to obtain a pure mixture of two chemical compounds.
It was the late 1950s and the beginnings of the Cold War. In Illinois, a Control Systems Laboratory had been working on various classified projects, but some of the research included computing. 3 scientists in the laboratory began to speculate how computing could be used in all fields and levels of education. This group was made up of Don Bitzer, an ECE professor and director of PLATO, Dan Albert, a physics professor and CSL head, and Chalmers Sherwin, a physicist. Bitzer launched PLATO in 1960, and while scientific curiosity was one of the larger reasons for the launch of a new computer system, he also wanted to focus on education and equality. Hello, and welcome to Memory Card, the history of video games, where we take a chronological view at gaming history. This is not just a look at video games in general, but a look at how they were made and who made them. Also, we cover other historical events in gaming history and any influential people as well. I'd been reading projections that said that 50% of the students coming out of our high schools were functionally illiterate, Bitzer said in a 1997 interview. Sherwin wasn't afraid to ask big questions. One day he asked, "Why can't we use computers for education?" Bitzer hooked a television tube to the ILLIAC-1 mainframe on campus and information displayed on the screen. This served as an introduction for many students to computer learning. In 1962, the Daily Illini, the university's student newspaper, wrote that the system had administered lessons about anything from French verb endings to mathematics. The article uses Little Jimmy to tell readers how this fancy new system works. Little Jimmy sits down at the computer for his lesson and flips the pages, typing on a keyboard if the system prompts him with a question. When he submits his answers, a bell rings. If he's correct, he can move on, but if it's wrong, he'll have to keep answering until he gets it right. He can ask for help, of course, and PLATO will give more detail. He can flip back and forth throughout the lesson. PLATO's first test was at Leal Elementary School in Urbana, and by the 1970s, the school had an interesting twist attached to computer learning for its students. At the grade school, an M&M's dispenser was hooked up to give the students candy when they completed lessons, and this system proved wildly popular, with students saving the M&M's as trophies for their success. A 2014 story on the program read. PLATO was expensive to run within the Loomis laboratory, and Bitzer devised an easier way for it to run using plasma screens. With this change, PLATO grew at a rapid pace. The university was able to connect PLATO to other university buildings, the local Parkland College, and elementary schools in the area. In 1968, the Illinois Board of Education invested in over $1 million to the project after both the National Science Foundation and the Department of Defense also backed it. By 1972, PLATO could be accessed by 1,000 users at once. The Illinois Board of Higher Education praised PLATO while announcing they would not open any more public senior colleges in the state. The university should develop plans for expanding the PLATO experimental program and for a possible eventual statewide PLATO teaching network, the board recommended. This was quoted in a 1971 Daily Illini article. PLATO continued to evolve using more complex programming languages, allowing for graphical, higher quality teaching. PLATO is uniquely noticeable by its monochrome display, using a kind of black and orange look, and allowed for downloadable character sets to display graphics. This was all displayed in a 512 by 512 display. Because of how the system was set up, students and coursework authors created their own programs for the device, such as Notes, which was similar to email and a newsgroup system that was connected to an online community. One of the first networked multiplayer games in history was created on PLATO, called Empire, which was themed after Star Trek, which we'll get to in just a bit. There was also an app called Talkomatic, which was a chat room. People would hang out in a channel and chat or flirt with whoever dropped by. David Woolley, a former student of Bitzer, wrote in his memoir, PLATO, The Emergence of Online Community. PLATO was also used in the Federal Aviation Administration to help train personnel on air traffic control and was installed in an FAA facility in Oklahoma City. It was used for training well into the 2000s. By 1985, PLATO had grown so large it was used in over 100 campuses, and even the Soviet Union wanted a piece of the pie, which they never got. But that is mostly where the history of PLATO ends, so let's get to some of the games that were on the system. The first game that we'll start off with is Empire. So unlike the Empire we touched on in the last episode, this Empire was largely influenced by Star Trek. The first game was dubbed Empire 1 and was written by Iowa State student John Delesk in 1973. This first version of the game allowed a maximum of 8 players to play the game. Silas Warner helped Delesk by providing disk space, and after Empire 1 was erased to bring up its sequel Empire 2, Warner revived Empire 1 and dubbed it Conquest. Empire 2 was written in the later part of 1973. It had much more of an emphasis on tactics. At the tail end of 1973, Delesk created Empire 3 in just 36 hours. This version of the game can still be played on Cyber 1 PLATO systems. This game received a lot of improvements and allowed players to be a rogue team rather than be affiliated with a faction. In 1976, the fourth installment was created by a team of Chuck Miller, Gary Fritz, John Delesk, and Jim Batten. The game was released in 1977 called Empire 4. The game also received a tournament version by Steve Peltz, which allowed annual tournaments between teams, with most being won by the Orion team. I'm happy to make the argument that this was the first instance of an esport. According to usage logs from the PLATO system, users spent a total of 300,000 hours playing Empire. The game was still available to play up to 2013, at least via cyber1.org, but I did some research and I'm not entirely sure that there's any emulator up and running for PLATO, which is unfortunate, as I would have liked to play some of those games myself. However, I could be wrong, and if anyone is aware that Cyber1 or any similar emulator is still running, please let me know. So now let's get on to the gameplay for Empire. So all control of the game had to be done by typing out commands, since PLATO terminals could not be operated by a mouse. The commands for the game were rather complicated, using degree headings, so I'm going to attempt to use an example provided on the Wikipedia page. So the degree heading commands were 0 for right, 90 for up, 180 for left, and 270 for down. Arrow keys could also be used. The main goal of the game is like any other Grand War strategy, to conquer the entire map, or galaxy. For this map, it contained 25 planets and 4 different races. These races were the Federation, Romulans, Orions, and Klingons. However, the Klingons were replaced by Khazari because the original game authors were reportedly pretty afraid of copyright infringement. Each team starts off with 3 planets in their home system. Each team starts in the corners of the map, kind of like a bigger version of Warlords. Each planet contains 50 armies at the start of the game, and neutral planets, not ruled by any team yet, have 25 AI armies. Surprisingly, the game could feature up to 30 players at once, with a max of 15 players per team. Each player pilots a starship, and players engage in dogfights with each other. They can also beam up armies to their ship and beam them down to planets to take them over. For a game this old, it is surprising at how complex it is, and honestly, I wish I could play it. It sounds like it would be a blast. On top of this, the races differ slightly. Orion ships have the weakest weapons but are fast, Romulans have the strongest weapons but are the slowest, and the Federation and Khazari ships are a little bit more balanced. Ships have the standard Star Trek weapons of phasers and photon torpedoes. Although this might sound like super action-packed, it seems like the game could take a while to get going. Flying to an enemy's system could take about 2 minutes, according to Wikipedia. Bombing a planet could take up to 10 minutes, and a whole game could take days. So it's kind of like Star Trek Monopoly. Instead, you don't have to clean up the mess because the cat knocks all the pieces over. I could get into more of the technical aspects of the game, but I don't think that's all particularly interesting. I definitely recommend reading the Wikipedia article if you want to learn more. The next game we'll look at is called The Dungeon, or Petit 5. The game was developed by Rusty Rutherford in 1975 for the University of Illinois Urbana campaign. Rutherford was playing Dungeons & Dragons and wanted to create a video game based off of it. Ironically, there was another game in development for PLATO called D&D, with the exact same idea. So while D&D was focused on creating a multiplayer experience, Rutherford was focused on creating a single-player experience. The game is called Petit 5 because Rutherford was a member for the Population and Energy group at the university. Each group is assigned a program slot, and the group had already used the first 3 slots, and Rutherford coded his game in the 5th slot. Rutherford actually used Petit 4 for the game's manual. Petit 5 was actually deleted because the system administrators deemed that the game was not appropriate for the resources. However, Rutherford was able to restore it. The game is often in consideration for one of the first dungeon crawler games. It could also be argued to be one of the first roguelike games, as it randomly generated monster encounters and treasures. Gameplay-wise, the game had 40 to 50 rooms to a single level, and the game could only store 20 players at a time. Much like other dungeon crawlers, the player's goal is to kill monsters and collect treasure. Upon encountering a monster, the player can use several spells. When encountering a monster, the player has to choose whether to fight, cast a spell, or run, and if the player doesn't decide quickly, the computer will simulate the fight with the player not being able to control it. Imagine if that happened in a Dark Souls boss fight. The computer would probably play better than me. So the next game on our list is the game we had just mentioned, which was it's called the Game of Dungeons, or D&D. So while Rutherford was making Petit 5, Gary Wisenhunt and Ray Wood were making D&D in 1974 at Southern Illinois University. The game was based on Dungeons & Dragons, which first released in 1974. D&D was written in the Tudor programming language, and after the initial release of the game, Dirk Pellet, who attended Iowa State University, and Flint Pellet, who attended University of Illinois, helped update the game from 1976 to 1985. D&D has a short history on its Wikipedia page, so let's just jump into the gameplay aspects. Much like the tabletop version, players create a character and adventure through what is known as Wisenwood Dungeon, a play on Gary Wisenhunt and Ray Wood's last names. The goal is to find the ultimate treasures, a grail and an orb. Players navigate the dungeon like a maze, and the game is presented in an overhead view. Players have several choices in the game, including going back to previous levels of the dungeon, and even leaving the dungeon altogether. This makes the game one of the first in history to have a non-linear progression. Completions of levels garner new spells for the player, along with weapons and items. The game also features some of the first instances of bosses, such as a golden dragon. However, that's not where the Dungeons & Dragons inspired games end for the PLATO system. Moria is another game that was inspired by Dungeons & Dragons and was created by Kevin Duncombe and Jim Batten in 1975. The game was also inspired by the aforementioned D&D. However, according to Wikipedia, Duncombe never played or read J.R.R. Tolkien or Dungeons & Dragons. Batten helped in making the game more 3D, as it uses a first-person type display, and Pellet, who we mentioned earlier, suggested the name of Moria. In a way, the game itself is actually not based on Lord of the Rings, as some might think of the name. It's more based on the other PLATO game D&D, which was based on Dungeons & Dragons. As for gameplay, there is not too much different than D&D other than the Wikipedia page specifically mentioning that up to 10 players can play the game at the same time. The game generates dungeons as well, as opposed to pre-computing them. And that is the extent that I will cover the PLATO games. There are several other games that I'll quickly mention that I couldn't really find too much info for. Airfight was a multiplayer flight simulator, and Avatar was a RPG dungeon crawler like the other games we discussed. Free Sail was a solitaire card game. Panther was a multiplayer tank driving simulator that featured games like Team Deathmatch, which became immensely popular much later in games kind of like Call of Duty and Halo. Spacism was a spaceflight simulator and first-person shooter. Oblet was another RPG dungeon crawler type game, but I could really not find much info on it. So I'm hoping there's something new that kind of comes out later, so I could potentially talk about that one as well. I highly suggest reading about these games in the best way you can. And if anything new comes out about these games, maybe I'll take another look in a retrospective type episode. But for now, that's going to do it for the PLATO games. As always, I can't do this without sources, and for this one I did mostly use Wikipedia, but that's because PLATO is a very niche type of system, but honestly it was amazing for its time. These games all sound like fun, and it's crazy to see how far roguelike dungeon crawlers have come since the early PLATO games. I hope you learned something and enjoyed this episode, and next time we'll take a look at Computer Space, the first arcade video game. See you then.